Okay, so what's my issue? My issue is that I have noticed over the last few years, this has been going on for many, many years, but over the last few years in particular, as a result of the pandemic, as a result of people staying home and watching more, consuming more content on the internet, and then writing or communicating their responses or their reactions to certain things, that there has been a marked devolution of language, in my opinion, characterized primarily by a phoneticizing of written language, meaning people are writing exactly the way they speak without any concern for the exact spellings of words or the exact usage of certain phrases or the exact punctuation of certain words and phrases. So there's this phoneticizing of language, and I've also noticed that there's just an increase, there's a proliferation and a acceptance of vulgarity and profanity and cursing and crass language in just about every YouTube video that I've come across. It seems to be standard practice. There's no, back in the old days, there used to be there still is, but it doesn't apply to YouTube. But there was an FCC, Federal Communications Commission, that monitored radio broadcasts and as well as television broadcasts, and decided that there were certain ways of communicating, certain vulgarity, even certain images that were not allowed. And this has evolved over the years. I remember reading somewhere where the classic situation comedy I Dream of Jeannie that came out in the 60s, they couldn't show Barbara Eden's belly button because that was considered a little too risque, a little too vulgar. So they covered it up in the final edits of the program. But in my mind, that's a good thing because it maintains a standard that society, that reflects a society at that moment. And, maybe society has just changed beyond my ability to appreciate it. But that's what I've noticed. And that's what I view as the current landscape. And there are people who will say, well, it's adult content, and if you don't want to watch it, you don't have to watch it, and which is true. But I think the content providers suffer as a result. Again, this is just my opinion, maybe not in the grand scheme of things as far as the majority public is concerned. But in my opinion, adult isn't synonymous with vulgar. There's no reason to be vulgar. There's no expectation of vulgarity just because you're discussing an adult topic. We can have an adult topic about adult discussion about relationships. We can have adult discussion about scientific principles in nuclear physics, and there's no need to curse when we communicate in this way. So it doesn't automatically mean that you have to curse, and that somehow cursing is expected simply because you're discussing adult content. And there are some people who will say, based on, influenced by George Carlin's famous routine, there's some people who will say they're just words, and the meaning, any meaning that I have attached to those words is simply society's attaching significance to those words. And yes, that's absolutely true. But the reality is that those meanings still are attached to those words. And there are still people who will judge you based on your use of those words. If you go in for a job interview and you're using certain vulgarity and street language, there's a limit to the sort of job that you're going to get because of the way that you communicate. So in my mind, it does matter. We're not at this stage where everyone in the society and the world agrees that they're just words and that cursing is universally accepted. It seems to be on that track, but at least not at the present. And there are people who say that language evolves and that it evolves to reflect the sensibilities and sensitivities of a particular generation. Again, that's all true, but we are still in a place where those words do have power. They have attachments and judgments with them. So in my opinion, the content providers are harmed by it. You may not see that harm in the number of subscribers, and some of the most subscribed to podcasts are people who curse incessantly. So there seems to be a certain wide spread acceptance to it. However, I believe that at some point, if at some point that gets reined in, there are people who will find that their reach gets limited because of their use of the vulgarity or profanity, and they'll end up getting canceled. So anyway, I still think it's unless you have a particular reason to appeal to a particular type of people who understand nothing but profanity and cursing, there's reason to keep the standards, to keep the bar high, to communicate in a professional manner. Again, this is my opinion. This is my suggestion as an author, as a fellow author, and this is my practice as an author, creating content, written content as well as YouTube content. Now, why does all this matter? Well, to me, it matters because the ignorance is spreading. If you haven't watched a movie called Idiocracy by Mike Judge, I think is the producer, definitely look that up. It's really fascinating, and it shows you what the potential outcome, it's a comedy, but it tells you what the potential outcome of a society that's putting less and less value on intelligence and less value on communication. Really fascinating. At the time that it came out, I think it was 1996, it was just seen as a comedy. But over the years, people have revisited that movie. It's become a classic now, and people are interviewing Mike Judge, asking how he could have been so prophetic, so prescient in his predictions about how society would eventually devolve. So it matters also to me because I see the collective dumbing down. I see children, a new generation coming up who don't know any better, who don't know that there is a standard, who don't know that cursing has a certain judgment attached to it. And therefore, they're just jumping in and producing content or speaking or writing in such a way that I think is lowering the bar and lowering the standards for the rest of society. And something else that came to mind is that they're new learners of the language. They're people for whom English is not their first language, not their native language. So they're learning that language, and they're watching YouTube videos, and a lot of content, most of the content is coming out in English. So they're learning how to speak, how to write, how to communicate by people who themselves are perpetuating this lower standard. So with that said, I'm going to share some of what I've come across and implore you not to make these same mistakes. Implore you in your communication, whether it's on an informal basis, whether it's written, or whether you are creating content for YouTube or some other video platform, or even doing courses on Teachable or Thinkific, that you be very careful about these particular transgressions that people have made in their writing. I'll just mention the transgression, and I'll give you a sentence that shows a different use of each word, and you can see how it's used correctly. So there are a lot of people who are misusing and simply switching and transposing there, and there, and they all sound the same. Here's a sentence. They're going to discover that there is a penalty for their abuse of language. All right. And next one is the difference between it's and its. It's such a shame that people don't know that good grammar is its own reward. Then there's a difference between to and too. Is it too much to ask you to learn to use these words correctly? Then there's a difference between your and your. You're embarrassing your teachers by writing this way. Then the difference between loose and lose, which people just spell any way that they want to at any point. If you play too fast and loose with these rules, you lose the right to expect the respect of your readers. Something else, slightly different category, is people are misusing that and who and which. So here's an example. Someone may say, he's the type of guy that always speaks correctly. Or he's one of the people which he's a person which sat next to me. And you'd be surprised how people misuse these. So the rule that I go by is things that and people who. If you're referring to things, if you're referring to an object, if you're referring to an inanimate object, if you're referring to an animal, you refer using that. And if you're referring to a person, a human being, you use who. Here's an example. This is the kind of rule, a thing, that is followed by people, a person, who know better. So things that, rules that, and people who. This is the kind of rule that is followed by people who know better. So we'll always remember things that and people who. Next, I've seen this written a lot. Now, when it's pronounced, someone will say, I should have gone to the supermarket, which is actually a contraction of should have. You should have paid attention in school instead of fooling around. A lot of people are just writing OF instead of the correct have. It's you should have, I should have, we could have paid attention in school instead of fooling around. And then speaking, there are certain words and phrases that people are misspeaking, and now some of them may be accepted, but they're not respected by people who know better. There are people who are mispronouncing. They're saying lackadaisical when the word is lackadaisical. They're saying I could care less when the phrase is I couldn't care any less. And if you think about it, if you really don't care about something, if you're at the bottom level of care for this particular thing or person, then you're way down at the bottom. You couldn't care any less. I'm as low as far down as I can go. So the phrase for people who know English is I couldn't care less. People will use the phrase exact same. It's the exact same color, which again is not technically incorrect, but it's just not. It's kind of lowbrow in my opinion. So you can say it's exactly the same, or you can just say it's the same. No need to be redundant. Again, continue on. People, content providers transitioning from one section of a video will say, okay, let's continue on. Again, not technically incorrect, but just redundant. No need to say continue on. It's let's continue. Where are we at? At the end of that sentence is totally unnecessary, and again, sounds kind of lowbrow. You can just say, where are we? This is where we are, or where are we? People will sometimes say mine's. This is that's yours, and this is mine's. Mine's is incorrect. The word is mine. People will be heard saying escape or axe. The word is escape. The word is ask. Now, this one has blown my mind before, but a lot of people, politicians who hold their fingers on the button, have a hard time, seemingly, to pronounce the word nuclear. And I've heard politicians, including past presidents of the United States, say nuclear, which just blows my mind figuratively. Some people also use they when they mean their. An example of that, a friend of mine sent me a video a couple weeks ago, and she wanted me to, she was sharing some information from a marketing guru who was doing well on the internet, and he was speaking about certain types of websites and how successful they can be purchasing his books. And at the beginning of the video, I was watching the interview, and he was speaking in such a way that he would say something like, "Yeah, so when they order their books, and and so he was using they, and at that point, I just couldn't continue. I couldn't see myself now as successful as this guy says he is on in the sales, and I have no reason to doubt it. I just couldn't find myself taking advice from someone who I believe is not communicating in a professional and in a way that is that I would expect. Again, this is just my opinion, and this is my issue. I may simply just have to get over it. Now, a big one that I see used and misused a lot is the past participle. And the past participle of certain verbs goes like this. I'll give you some examples. Go, went, and gone. So one is the present tense, one is the past tense, and gone is the past participle. Eat, ate, eaten. Write, wrote, written, cry, cried, and in some cases the past participle is the same as the past tense. So you'll get cried and cried. I'll give you some examples. So I go to the supermarket. I went to the supermarket. I have gone to the supermarket. They had gone to the supermarket. We should have gone to the supermarket. So when you're using something in that way, when you're creating the present perfect either with have or has, or the past perfect with had, then you use the past participle, gone. You don't use the past tense. So there are a lot of times you'll hear this a lot. People creating content will say, he should have went, or I could have went to the supermarket. And again, to me, that's just grating on the nerves, just like the vulgarity. Let's see. So that's something. I'll include a list of all the different forms of words and their past participles. That seems to be something that just has eluded the educational system here. So a lot of people are simply misusing it. And you, as an author, following the Little Flights of Fancy Writers course, will not make that mistake in your writing or your speaking, because you have a teacher who is looking out for you. And then the big one is literally. Now, you'll hear this everywhere. Everyone in this last few years is overusing, misusing the word literally. So much so, in fact, that there is, if you look it up, this misuse is now gaining acceptance, and people are, and it's being listed as acceptable. Now, in my opinion, as I said, it may be accepted, but it's not respected by people who have a higher standard. So let me give you an example. People will say, oh, he just literally came and sat next to me, or he literally walked down the street right behind me, or whatever. So literally it means in a literal manner, which means in a physical, real manner, as opposed to figuratively or metaphorically. Now, let me give you an example. If you're a speaker of English, you might be familiar with the phrase, the metaphor, let's try walking on eggshells. Now, if you're not familiar, the term walking on eggshells is a metaphor that means that you have to act carefully, you have to walk gingerly, you have to walk with care, behave with care. And an example of that is, let's say I grew up with an abusive parent. So in my household, I grew up with an abusive mother or father. So in my household, I had to walk on eggshells every day, which is saying, metaphorically, that I had to be very careful what I said, what I did, so as not to incur the wrath of my abusive parent. So I had to walk on eggshells. And if you picture it, walking on eggshells, you have to be very careful. You have to step very lightly. You have to watch where you step so that you don't get cut by the eggshells, or that you don't make a lot of noise on the eggshells. So walking on eggshells is a metaphor. It's just a phrase that we use. That's what it means. Now, let's suppose that one day I'm at home and my abusive parent is sleeping on the couch, and I'm in the kitchen preparing a meal, and I accidentally drop a carton of eggs on the floor, and they all break and crack. But fortunately, it doesn't wake up my abusive parent. But I now have to go to the other side of the house to get through the living room to get the mop to clean it up. So in this case, I could say I literally had to walk on eggshells to get the mop. Now you see how that works? So now, instead of it just being a metaphor, it's now real. I now actually had to physically walk on eggshells. In other words, literally had to walk on eggshells in order to get to the mop. to clean up the eggs. So that's a case where you are correctly using the word literally. I literally had to walk on eggshells, because you are making a distinction between something being literal, meaning real, physical, in a physical reality, and something being metaphorical, which is the phrase walking on eggshells. So you use the word literally in a case where you're referring to some metaphor or some expression that has now taken on physical, real reality. So if you're not using it in that sense, then you are misusing it. And that's a big one for me. So, and I guess the final one is just the vulgarity. I made reference to it before, but there's just such misuse. There are certain websites certain channels I simply have blocked, because the only thing I can be sure of is that from the very first sentence out of the presenter's mouth, there's going to be vulgarity. I just think it's unnecessary, and there are certain things that I won't recommend, just because to me it's just a grating on the nerves constantly to listen to the vulgarity. Comedy is not synonymous with vulgarity. There, you can still make people laugh without resorting to vulgarity. Sure, I know there's some certain instances where it just makes a point correctly, but for the most part, people seem to be using it just as a crutch of communication. For me, I love watching comedy videos. That's why I subscribe to Dry Bar Comedy, where I can be assured that there won't be any vulgarity. And some of the funniest comedians I've come across have been on that channel. So just as an aside, check out Dry Bar Comedy on YouTube. But so that's it. Now, what can be done? What can we do about this? Or should anything be done? Now, again, this is just my opinion. So what I'd like to suggest is that perhaps, as I phrased it in my Raise the Bar manifesto, what if by simply improving your presentation, speaking clearly, using correct grammar, refraining from profanity, and presenting your content in a professional manner, you could actually get more subscribers, get more shares and likes, and grow your channel, and ultimately make more money? I would like that to be the incentive. I would like people to live in a reality whereby being, and it's such a shame that you have to that we're at a stage where that becomes the aspiration. We're just maintaining a regular bar becomes the higher aspiration. But I'd like to see that people actually get rewarded for creating professional content. I'd love to know what your opinion of this is. And the other thing that I thought about is I used to do a radio show years ago on New York radio, and that I became familiar with the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, as I mentioned, and there was a certain standard. There is no FCC or equivalent for YouTube. It's a private company, and so they can put out whatever they want. But I would like to see something maybe akin to the Parental Advisory lyrics that caused a big stir in the music industry years ago. And I know the minute I mention that, some people will object because they see it somehow as an infringement of free speech. Now, there's nothing, as an independent producer, we'd all like you to have the freedom to create whatever content you like. But on the receiving end, there are those of us who would like to be aware of what it is that we are consuming. So I would like, and I obviously wouldn't have any issue with conforming to that, just from my own standards. But I'd love to know what your opinion is on that. Is if there should be an FCC equivalent on YouTube to either just tag or tag certain content as being overly profane, if that's something that you want to avoid. Love to hear your views on that. So anyway, that's it for now. Those are my thoughts. I'm going to share with you a sentence. I'll give you a test. Since this is a course, I'll give you a test to see if you can find the cases of bad grammar in this. I'll read it to you here. There's literally no way to escape their bad grammar. It's like they could care less about it too. Sometimes I wonder if they had went to school at all. If they did, they should have continued on with their education in the expletive deleted school where they were at. I'm losing my mind. So there are at least 14 violations, transgressions here in that sentence. Leave your comments about it in the below. And in closing, I'll read to you a life rhyme. This is one of my poetic reflections on life. And if you want to read about 486 more of those, you can go to liferhymes.com. But this one is the one I wrote for an article called Language Blues. Yes, the language is devolving. Their grammar is incorrect. A sign of times, no doubt, I'm sure, but what if left unchecked? Entertainment is just vulgar. All the comedy is profane. News anchors are no better, and it's driving me insane. The spelling is atrocious. The speaking just sounds dumb. The parts of speech forgotten and their futures looking glum. It's all across the spectrum. Yes, no matter who they are. Presidents and politicians speak like sailors in a bar. I never learned emoji. No, it's not my native tongue. I can't relate to music nor the way the songs are sung. Perhaps I'll just get over it, forget or just forgive. Some say that language must reflect the world in which we live. I wouldn't be the first to rant and rail against things new. My only consolation is if you write and say, me too. And with that, thanks for watching. Share this with your friends if you have similar opinions. And again, let me know in the comments what you think.